Miss Marple and the Pigeons That Stopped Coming Back. Chapter 1. The wings of silence. The early autumn sun warmly illuminated the small village of Little Davington, where time seemed to stand still among the shrub-lined paths, perfectly manicured. Gardens and bell towers that punctually marked the hours. The leaves were beginning to turn golden on the lime trees along the main path, and the air lingered with that unmistakable aroma of homemade jam, damp wood, and mild tobacco that so aptly defined English rural life. It was the day of the annual village fair, a tradition that Mrs. Perry insisted had begun back when you still needed a Queen's licence to sell apples. Stalls filled the lawns beside the parish hall. Pickles, pies, knitting, rag dolls, and, as every year, the display of carrier pigeons belonging to Edmund Cleaver, the reclusive farmer on the outskirts of the village. The pigeons, white as freshly washed linen, were in their cages, well-fed, restless but elegant. Edmund, with his weathered face and immaculate moustache, spoke proudly of his aerial lineage, claiming that some of his birds could find their way from Scotland without hesitation. And as always, at 3 o'clock sharp, he gave his demonstration. He released 6 pigeons, one by one, and they all rose in circles before disappearing into the open sky toward their dovecote. But that afternoon, something was different. Only 3 returned, and no one noticed the difference at first. After all, who, apart from Mr. Cleaver, really paid attention to birds? It was Miss Emily Farrow, a woman with a high-pitched voice and permanently surprised eyes, who sowed the first seed of concern during the post-fair tea. "It's strange that Edmund seemed so upset after the show," she murmured as she spread jam on a biscuit. "Did you see his face? Like someone had stepped on his soul." "Oh, nonsense," Mrs. Perry replied. "I'm sure one got distracted or landed on another roof. It wouldn't be the first time that's happened." "But 3, my dear," Miss Marple chimed in from her usual corner by the window, her voice soft as a murmur among the leaves. 3 stray pigeons. A coincidence, perhaps. 3, it's a pattern. All eyes turned to her briefly, but she didn't insist. The old woman, with her sky-blue shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting needles resting in her lap, simply gazed at the distant fields with a thoughtful expression, as if something invisible had changed between the bushes and the sky. That night the calm remained, or at least it seemed that way. The next day the local postman, Fred Whitcomb, a man meticulous to a fault, was the one who found the body, lying face down in the small meadow at the edge of the Cleaver estate, his hat still on, his arms held in a curiously rigid position, and a bloody white wing clutched in his hand. The body was that of Edmund Cleaver. The news swept through Little Davington like an alarmed flock. An accident, a heart attack, a murder? Responses seemed scarce, but opinions were not. Miss Marple, for her part, had already put on her wool coat and most discreet hat. Not out of morbid curiosity or detective intent, as some people in the grocery store would maliciously say, but because, as she well knew, when the birds stop returning, something has begun to rot in the air. And the pigeons, it seems, were just the first warning. Chapter 2. Whispers in the hedges. Edmund Cleaver's death settled over the village like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. Little Davington, which had lived on routines and small pleasures, now reeled from a new, dark secret that seemed to lurk behind every iron gate and every steaming cup of tea. By mid-morning, the body had been removed, and Detective Inspector Nathan Bell, a young man with city ambitions, arrived from Downham Market in his official car. He was tall, handsome, and, according to Mrs. Perry, too smart to know where a spade is kept. No one told him so directly, of course, but several agreed that he smelled more of cologne than common sense. The scene had been clean. No signs of a struggle, no visible fingerprints beyond those of Cleaver himself and the postman who found him. No blood, save for the faint stain on the wing of the dead pigeon the farmer was still holding. A sudden death, perhaps cardiac arrest, Dr. Llewellyn commented, jotting something down in his notebook with a trembling pen, though the expression on his face, yes, well, it's somewhat unusual, as if he'd seen something shocking, perhaps. Or someone, corrected Miss Marple, who was listening from a nearby bench, her hands clasped in her lap, like just another guest at a Sunday picnic. Inspector Bell barely concealed his annoyance. "Lady Marple, Jane Marple," she replied with a polite smile. "Just an old friend of observation, Inspector. I've seen more deaths than I care to remember, and I know when someone dies too upright." Bell simply nodded, not inclined to argue with a soft-spoken old woman, but something in her words seemed to stick like a pin in his thoughts. Meanwhile, the people murmured. At the grocery store, in line at the bakery, on the park benches, everyone had their theory that Edmund had been poisoned by a rival pigeon breeder from a neighbouring village, that he had discovered a secret buried in his land, that the missing birds carried messages that were never meant to be. Miss Emily Farrow, wasting no time, enthusiastically shared her version in a low voice with anyone who would listen. "Did you know he never married because he was in love with Mrs. Castleton? And that she married the Reverend only out of spite? Imagine! A broken heart for 30 years can drive anyone mad. I saw him arguing with his nephew 2 days ago," added Arthur, the young man from the mill. "Something about money and the old man's will." Miss Marple, for her part, walked slowly along the path that bordered the church, her thoughts as silent as her footsteps. She observed the houses, the curtains that opened as she passed, the hedges trimmed with a precision that betrayed nerves, the flower pots that had just been moved. Small details, imperceptible to those looking for drama, but not to her. "Why hold? A bloody wing?" he muttered to himself. "A sign, or a message he couldn't deliver." He stopped in front of the old wooden kiosk, now disused, where newspapers had once been sold. On its dusty bench, a white feather lay alone, caught in the cracks in the floor. He didn't touch it, he just looked at it. "The pigeons that didn't return," he whispered. "Where were they meant to go?" Not far away, from an upstairs window of the rectory, Mrs. Castleton watched her silently. Her once warm eyes now had a shadow that didn't match the afternoon sun. She slowly closed the curtain, and that night, as the village slept uneasily, a slender figure walked through the trees near the old Cleaver estate well. Something slid into the water, a soft splash, then nothing more. At dawn, the 3 missing pigeons had still not returned. Chapter 3. A Garden Too Tidy. The 3rd day after Edmund Cleaver's death dawned with a breeze blowing dry leaves along the paths of Little Davington. The sky, overcast but rainless, seemed to share the sombre mood of the village, where conversations, though still accompanied by scones and cups of tea, became more cautious, as if the crime could hear them. In the rectory, Mrs. Castleton was preparing breakfast with tense movements. The sound of the knife-cutting toast was harsher than necessary, and when her husband, Reverend Castleton, entered the kitchen, her lips were already pressed into a thin line. "Did you sleep badly?" he asked softly. "I dreamed about birds," she replied without looking at him. "Again! This time, one of them was bleeding." The Reverend didn't reply. He poured the tea thoughtfully and awkwardly changed the subject, as he always did when his wife seemed too close to saying something important. The tension in the rectory wasn't new, but since Cleaver's death, it had taken on an almost physical quality, like cobwebs hanging from unspoken words. Meanwhile, Miss Marple walked towards the Cleaver estate, not out of mere curiosity, but because human nature rarely leaves voids unfilled. And something about the place, with its rusty fence and newly landscaped garden, seemed too controlled. The deceased's nephew, Julian Cleaver, had arrived that same morning from Norwich. He was dressed in black, though his expression conveyed annoyance rather than grief. He greeted Inspector Bell with the automatic politeness of someone who had rehearsed how to show concern. "I never understood your obsession with those birds," he commented as he walked around the porch of the house. "I didn't even like them. Raise them, release them, and wait for them to come back. Ridiculous." "Didn't you visit him often?" Bell asked. "I didn't need it. We wrote to each other occasionally. He was lonely, stubborn, and old-fashioned, like this town." "And yet you're here," Miss Marple chimed in from the gate. "That shows you cared about something. Or did you come for some other reason?" Julian raised an eyebrow, surprised by the old woman's presence. Bell looked a little uncomfortable, but didn't stop her. "I'm Miss Marple. I just watch, and I remember. Much more than meets the eye. Are you implying something?" "Oh, no," she said sweetly. "It's just that gardens like this rarely take care of themselves, and this one was clearly pruned yesterday, but you arrived today." Julian didn't respond. He looked at the freshly cut hedge, and then at the inspector, as if waiting for him to say something in his defence. Bell, however, was also looking at the garden with a grim expression. "Do you know who could have done it?" Bell asked. "Not me," Julian said tersely. "Maybe the gardener, although I doubt he's still coming. My uncle fired him 2 weeks ago, according to what he told me in a letter. Something about an argument over some stolen tools." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Funny. Firing someone and still having perfect hedges. Some details just don't cut themselves." Later that day, while the inspector and Julian were searching the house, Miss Marple wandered toward the back of the property, where the old boxwood trees grew. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but her habit of wandering with her eyes open had led her to discover more in quiet gardens than any uniformed detective in an interrogation room. And there, among the branches, he found something. A small crumpled piece of paper, half buried in the damp earth. He carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a letter, not a list, not even a complete note. Just a sentence, written in firm handwriting, in ink already smudged by dew. "And if they come back, they'll know what I did. Miss Marple put the paper in her bag with the delicacy of someone picking up a broken petal. She said nothing to the inspector. Not yet. The secrets of the garden weren't ready to be told yet, but they soon would be, and very close by, a young figure, too young to be wandering around alone at that hour, watched her from a distance, half hidden behind the cemetery's stone wall. His eyes were fixed on the old woman, and his breathing was shaky. No one knew that she had seen anything the night the pigeons died, and soon she would have to decide whether to remain silent or tell what she knew. Chapter 4. The Girl in the Stone Wall. The next morning, the air was fresher, and dew hung on the low branches as if the town itself were secretly mourning. In Little Davington, things moved forward with that peculiar rhythm of small places. Everything seemed at a standstill, and yet, beneath the surface, changes were subtle but constant. Conversations were repeated, gestures took on new meanings, and suspicions were woven with the same patience with which old women knitted scarves on park benches. Miss Marple had spent part of the night mentally sorting out the threads that were already beginning to intertwine. Julian Cleaver, too keen to feign indifference, an absent but not forgotten gardener, a note buried like someone burying a guilty conscience, and most disturbingly, a childlike figure behind the wall. That figure now had a name. "Daisy, where's your mother?" Miss Marple asked, seeing her sitting alone on the bench in front of the pond, her feet dangling and her dress slightly stained with mud. The girl, no more than 8 years old, looked up slowly. Her eyes were dark and wide, like those of someone who has seen something she doesn't yet fully understand. At home, she's cleaning the curtains because she says everything reeks of tragedy, she replied in a calm voice, as if talking about the weather. Miss Marple sat down beside him slowly, saying nothing for a few minutes. She just stared at the reflection of the clouds in the water and let the silence take its course. "Did you escape yesterday afternoon too?" he asked suddenly, without looking at her. "The stone wall is a good hiding place, but the moss on your knees gives you away." Daisy looked down and began to tear a sheet of paper with her fingers. "I didn't mean to spy. I just like watching pigeons. When they circle in the sky, they look like they're dancing." "And did you see anything else that afternoon?" Daisy didn't respond immediately. She looked around, as if she was afraid that even the bushes might give her away. "I saw someone by the well. Not Edmund. It was someone else, taller. He was wearing a dark jacket and a hat. I didn't see his face, but he dropped something in the water. Then he looked around very quickly. I hid, and you didn't say anything. My mum says kids should keep quiet when adults get into trouble." "But then I saw the pigeon, the one with the spotted wing. It was on the ground. It wasn't flying." Miss Marple didn't ask any more questions. She took an embroidered handkerchief out of her bag and offered it to him with a smile. "You've been very brave. Keeping secrets is hard, but sometimes sharing one with the right person can save someone, or prevent someone else from getting hurt." Daisy nodded silently. That afternoon, while Inspector Bell was talking with the coroner about the still unfinished tests, Miss Marple discreetly made her way to the well at the Cleaver estate. The rope had been removed, the bucket as well, but something about the dampness of the stones suggested that not everything was in place. "Inspector," he said casually as he left the house, "any reason the well is empty?" Belle looked at her in surprise. "Empty?" "Yes, no bucket, no rope, as if someone wanted nothing to be taken out of there. Are you implying that something was thrown?" "I'm not implying it, I know. Someone I trust told me." Belle frowned. He ordered a lantern brought in, and after securing some temporary rope, he tied a small metal basket to it. They carefully lowered the improvised device. Minutes later, they pulled him out with difficulty. Inside, soaking wet and wrapped in a blue silk scarf, lay the remains of a small, hardcover book. Its cover was almost illegible, but when opened, several carefully written pages could still be made out. The contents, although water-damaged, were enough to provoke a tense silence. On one of the pages, in slightly blurred ink, one could clearly read, "I'll tell him if he doesn't answer. I can't carry this any more." Belle turned to Miss Marple with a grave expression. "A diary, or worse," she whispered, "a confession yet to be uttered. And someone made sure it never happened." Nearby, behind the living-room window, Julian Cleaver watched the scene. In his hand, he held a cup of tea he hadn't bothered to drink. His eyes never left the well. And a few houses away, Mrs. Castleton began writing a letter. The ink was firm. The address was to someone she hadn't seen in over 20 years. And meanwhile, the 3 pigeons that never returned remained absent. But someone knew exactly why. Chapter 5. The Letter Never Sent. The discovery of the book in the well spread through the village like a stale, persistent perfume. Although Inspector Bell had attempted to handle the matter discreetly, the murmur of curious lips could not be silenced. The words confession, diary, and culpability. They began to creep into conversations as innocent as the choice of bread or the temperature of tea. Miss Marple, however, didn't let herself be swept away by the maelstrom of suppositions. Her pace remained the same, calm, methodical, with a serenity that unsettled those who knew that behind her friendly smile lay a mind that didn't forget a single gesture or a single word. That afternoon she went to the rectory. There was something in the way Mrs. Castleton moved away from the windows when someone passed, something in the stiffness with which she now arranged the flowers on the altar, that made a silent bell ring in Miss Marple's mind. The Reverend received her with rehearsed courtesy. "Miss Marple, how unexpected! Would you like a cup of tea? Only if it's the lavender blend I used to keep in the blue box on the sideboard. I always said it had the perfect balance of scent and calming." Mrs. Castleton looked at her surprised, but said nothing. She retreated to the kitchen while Miss Marple looked around the living room. There was order, yes, too much order. Not a speck of dust, not a book out of place. And yet the air was tense, as if the walls were holding their breath. On the table, in the corner, neatly stacked, were several letters, all sealed, all in the same elegant handwriting. But one, farther away, was without an envelope, folded in half, as if it had been written, and then deliberately forgotten. Miss Marple didn't touch it. She only came close enough to read the first few words. "I can't keep pretending. That afternoon on the farm, when I saw him." Mrs. Castleton's voice made her turn slowly. "Here you go. I hope you still like it with a drop of milk." As always, Miss Marple replied, gratefully accepting the cup. "It's nice to see some things don't change. Although in this village, a lot of things have lately, haven't they? Little Davington has always been a quiet place. Calm? Perhaps. But restless souls don't always respect well-tended gardens. Sometimes secrets take root deeper than lilies." The Reverend looked down at her tea, her hands shaking. For a moment, they both remained silent, listening to the distant ticking of the hall clock. "Edmund Cleaver was a difficult man," he said finally. "Proud, rigid, years ago. He made mistakes, many, wounds that never healed. Between you? Not in the sense people imagine," he replied in a whisper. "But we shared something, a brief past, a decision that bound us together forever." Miss Marple nodded slightly. She asked no more questions. As she left the rectory, she ran into young Arthur, the mill owner. He was carrying a sack of flour, and his shirt was soaked with sweat, but his face showed more than just fatigue. "Miss Marple," he said nervously, "I've been thinking about something. I don't know if it matters, maybe not. But I saw the nephew, Julian, the night before the funeral. He was hanging around near the solicitor's office when the lights were out. He didn't see me, or he pretended not to." "Broughton and Wells's office? Yes, that one. And he was carrying something under his arm, like a folder." Miss Marple thanked him with a gesture and continued on her way. The puzzle was taking shape, but there were still pieces missing. Not just about Edmund's death, but about the underlying reason. Because this wasn't just a crime. It was a reckoning, carefully disguised as misfortune. That night Inspector Bell visited her at her home. "Miss Marple," he said, placing a sealed bag on her desk. "This is what we were able to recover from the book. Some entries are legible. The ink has run, but there's one sentence that's repeated several times." He showed him a sheet of paper. "To Beale, promise I broke still weighs heavily. The blood wasn't mine, but the silence was." Miss Marple read silently. Then she closed her eyes for a moment. "Someone wants us to forget the past, Inspector, but the past doesn't die. It just hides, until a tainted wing brings it to light. And in the darkness of the night, on the roof of the rectory, a white dove landed. It was limping, injured, but alive." He had returned. Chapter 6. The message in the plumage, the news of the injured pigeon on the rectory roof, spread like wildfire. In Little Davington, where everyone knew everyone, a creature returning from the sky after days of absence had something miraculous or disturbing about it. It was Reverend Castleton himself who found it when he went out into his back garden with a basket of firewood. The bird, white as freshly milked milk, was resting on the ledge, its right wing bent at an odd angle, and a faint brown patch on its plumage. It didn't attempt to fly when it saw him. It just stared at him, motionless, as if it knew its journey had ended right there. Soon Miss Marple arrived at the rectory. She said nothing when the Reverend showed her the pigeon. She knelt beside it with surprising agility for her age, and examined the injured wing with careful hands. Then, with reverential delicacy, she felt under one of the thickest feathers on its back and extracted what looked like a thin strip of paper, wound with a barely visible red thread. "A message?" the Reverend asked, flustered. "Yes. One that, had it arrived in time, might have changed the ending of this story." Miss Marple replied, unfolding it very slowly. The paper was wrinkled, damp, but still legible. The handwriting was firm, masculine, clearly handwritten. "I can't. Keep covering this up. If you don't answer me by Friday, I'll hand everything over to the police. This is my final warning." It was not signed. The Reverend and his wife, who now stood behind him on the threshold, her face pale as a dove, exchanged a look laden with meaning. Miss Marple pretended not to notice. She put the message in her handbag like a relic. "Do you recognize the handwriting, Mrs. Castleton?" It took her a moment to respond. "I think so. It's Edmund's. His handwriting was always impeccable, like himself, even his threats." Who was this message addressed to? Mrs. Castleton looked down. The silence thickened. "I don't know for sure," he said finally. "But if he wrote it, it was because he had decided to speak out, after years of keeping quiet." "About what?" "About something that happened a long time ago," the Reverend chimed in, his voice firm but cracking. "Before Edmund isolated himself on his estate, before he stopped talking to half the town. Something some of us prefer to bury, like the dead, the Monsieur." Marple nodded slowly. "Most tragedies begin like this, with long silences, cowardly decisions, and wounds that fester beneath Sunday smiles." That same afternoon, Inspector Bell examined the message with growing frustration. "We don't know who he wrote it to. We have no proof it was ever sent. And the will still hasn't turned up. Julian insists he hasn't seen it. But the notary says Edmund updated it just a month ago. Something's changed in him lately." "Perhaps because he decided to stop protecting someone," Miss Marple murmured. "Whom?" She didn't answer. But something had awakened in his mind, a barely formed suspicion that was beginning to tie up the loose ends. The tension between the Castletons, the sudden visit from his nephew, the disappearance of the Pigeons just after, a written threat, the diary in the well. It all seemed part of the same sad symphony, one whose finale had yet to be played. Later, in the silence of her parlour, Miss Marple reread the note, not for what it said, but for how it said it. Date: Friday. That meant Edmund still had hope for an answer. A reconciliation, perhaps, but someone got there first. And then he remembered something. At the fair, the day the Pigeons were released, Mrs. Castleton hadn't been present. Neither she nor her husband. They had claimed a family commitment, an unexpected visit. But no one could confirm such a visit. What if it wasn't a social absence, but a deliberate evasion? The next day, the second dove was found by a boy on the outskirts of the village, among some bushes, still alive, but exhausted. It also had a message. This one was much shorter. "I won't go any further. Either you talk, or I will." Miss Marple read those words with increasing clarity. Someone had intended for those messages to arrive, but they didn't make it in time. And if the third dove returned, if it did, it wouldn't just bring answers. It would bring consequences. Chapter 7. The Man Who Was Afraid of Silence. The third pigeon didn't return the next day, or the next. The sky turned grey, as if sharing the uncertainty that was beginning to settle in every corner of Little Davington. What began as curiosity was now a latent unease, an invisible weight that altered the rhythm of conversations and the tone of the church bells. while the neighbours chatted about trivial matters more intensely than usual, as if seeking to exercise a presentiment. Miss Marple strolled through the village with her leisurely gait, greeting everyone with the same politeness as always. But her eyes, those sharp yet gentle eyes, seemed to see beyond the neatly trimmed hedges and the freshly whitewashed facades. It was a windy morning when he decided to stop by Mr. Hawthorne's small antique shop. A wiry man with a half-trimmed beard, he rarely spoke more than necessary. But in the last few days, something in his demeanour had changed. He closed earlier. He lowered the blinds even when there were still hours of daylight left. And above all, he avoided eye contact. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," Miss Marple greeted her as she entered. "I've come to get that box of postcards you promised to show me, the ones you found in the attic next to the old sheet music." "Oh, yeah, sure," he stammered, searching for them half-heartedly, "though I'm afraid they're not as interesting as they seemed." Sometimes seemingly harmless things hide secrets. "Like doves," she added casually, watching him pause. For a second his back tense. "The pigeons! Yes, the ones who didn't return. And then they did, with messages." Hawthorne dropped one of the postcards. His face had paled noticeably. "What a strange business. I don't like to talk about the dead, Miss Marple. One ends up attracting their ghosts. I don't think Edmund Cleaver was a ghost. More like someone who decided in his final act to stop keeping quiet. Did you receive any of those pigeons, Mr. Hawthorne?" The man looked up abruptly. "What do you say? Pigeons don't fly randomly. They carry messages to specific destinations. Edmund used codes, repeated routes. Didn't you find it curious that they all return to points connected to his past?" Hawthorne swallowed. The twitching of his left eyelid betrayed more than any words could have. "You and Edmund, weren't you partners in a certain business, one that closed abruptly 20 years ago?" "That was another life," he replied hoarsely. "It has nothing to do with what happened now." "Are you sure?" Miss Marple asked, tilting her head slightly. "Because everything indicates that Edmund wanted to restore balance, to restore what had been hidden, and someone, perhaps more than one, couldn't allow it." Hawthorne walked up to the counter and sat down heavily. "Do you know the worst thing about remorse, Miss Marple?" he said with a bitter smile. "It doesn't go away with time. It only changes form. You learn to disguise it with silence, pride, indifference. But it never stops talking. It just waits for someone to listen. What did Edmund do? Or what did you do?" Hawthorne looked down. "I can't say it, not without consequences, not for me, for others." "Then the pigeon will say it," whispered Miss Marple. He looked at her puzzled, as because the third hasn't returned yet. And if she does, she'll bring the final message. The one that might reveal everything. And then silence will no longer be an option. The next day, at dusk, a white shadow appeared against the orange sky. The third dove. It descended slowly onto the church steeple. The wound on its wing was less serious, but its feathers were dirty, and it seemed to carry with it the weight of everything left unsaid. Miss Marple was notified almost immediately. When she arrived, Inspector Bell was already on the scene, wearing gloves and carrying a cardboard box. "Here it is, the last one," he said, as they retrieved the message tied to his leg with a thin, dark thread. It was longer than the previous ones. The letters were hurried, written with suppressed fury. "I can't keep quiet any longer. You and I did it. We covered it up, but she knows, and if you talk, you'll go down with me. Remember, she saw what happened in the well." Belle Mireau and Miss Marple. "She? Daisy," she said simply. Belle paled. "What did you see?" Miss Marple didn't reply. Not yet. But the puzzle was almost complete. The pigeons had made their journey. The words, though late, had arrived, and now the crime was beginning to unravel. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Well. The third dove had said it all, or almost everything. Its message, though fragmentary and cryptic, was more revealing than any official statement. The words, "You and I did it, and she knows," were enough to transform suspicions into a concrete silhouette, still vague but clearly human. Miss Marple didn't celebrate the discovery. The truth, as always, arrived frayed, incomplete, and at a cost that couldn't be measured in physical evidence. She had learned in her years of silent observation that behind every crime there was not only a guilty mind, but a longer, sadder story, and almost always a wound that hadn't healed properly. That evening she sat with Daisy in her mother's backyard. The girl, who had been strangely quiet the past few days, seemed less restless, as if telling a part of the truth had lifted an invisible weight from her. "Do you remember exactly what you saw, my dear?" Miss Marple asked tenderly. Daisy nodded, her chin resting on her knees. "I saw two people. One threw something into the well. Then he gave something to the other, a small box. The other person hid it in his coat. Then they went in different directions. But before they left, one of them kicked a rock against the well. He was angry. Could you see their faces? One, yes, Mr. Hawthorne. The other, I think it was Julian. But he was wearing a hat, and he walked strangely, like he didn't want to be there." Miss Marple nodded. That was enough. That same evening, Inspector Bell summoned both men to the parish hall office. Nothing official, just an informal conversation. But the tension was palpable even before it began. Julian Cleaver arrived punctually, his face clean-shaven and defiant. Hawthorne, on the other hand, looked older than usual, as if time had suddenly passed him by. "Gentlemen," Bell began, "we have found 3 doves, 3 messages, and something far more valuable, a witness. A little girl saw 2 men by the well the night before Edmund Cleaver died. One of them threw an object into the water. The other hid a box. Do you have anything to say?" Hawthorne swallowed. Julian crossed his arms. "A girl? Is that what they have? Childish gossip?" "It's not gossip if it's repeated accurately, Mr. Cleaver," Miss Marple chimed in from a corner. "And if it's consistent with physical evidence. The box that was thrown down the well contained pages from a diary, a confession, a man's attempt to free himself from a past you two shared." Julian looked at her coldly. "My uncle was paranoid. He shut himself off from the world. He wrote nonsense. He always believed someone wanted revenge on him for things that didn't even exist." "Are you sure about that?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Because Edmund mentioned that if you didn't talk, he would, that he no longer wanted to protect you, that you were about to fall out of favour in his will. For a moment, Julian's mask cracked. "That's absurd," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "I didn't even know I'd changed the will." But you did know that the old man was no longer willing to remain silent, and that you couldn't allow it, Belle added. A tense silence filled the room. It was Hawthorne who broke the calm. "He didn't kill him," she said, looking at the ground. "Nor did I. We were just trying to protect ourselves. Edmund threatened to tell, to reveal everything about the fraudulent loan, about the money that disappeared from the parish fund over 20 years ago. He said he'd written everything in his diary, and that if we didn't stop him, he'd make it public. He wanted to expose everything, even if it ruined his family. So they destroyed the diary," Belle said. "Not everything," Miss Marple added, showing a recovered sheet of paper. "Some parts survived enough. The rest is filled in by gestures, looks, fear." Julian stood up abruptly. "So what? He'll arrest us for throwing a book down a well, for being reckless 2 decades ago. There's no evidence we've harmed anyone." "And Edmund Cleaver?" Miss Marple asked. "Who found him dead with a bloody pigeon? Who knew he'd threatened to speak out just that Friday, and turned up dead that same night?" Julian didn't respond. His face was rigid and white. "I didn't kill him," he said finally. "But I didn't mourn his death. That's all I can tell you." Inspector Bell didn't answer, but he signalled his assistant, who approached with a sealed folder. "We have the toxicology report. Traces of belladonna in his system. Someone poisoned him slowly. The final dose arrived on the day of the festival, and it was enough." Miss Marple stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt. "It's not just the act that condemns," he said. "Sometimes it's the time in which one decides to remain silent, what one allows to happen while pretending not to see." And while Inspector Bell arrested Julian Cleaver on suspicion of murder, Mr. Hawthorne covered his face with his hands. Outside, the night was cold, but on the church roof a white dove was perched again, as if the cycle had come full circle. Finally. Chapter 9. The Unheard Confession. Julian Cleaver's arrest shook Little Davington to its foundations like few things had before. Neighbours, so prone to smiling and talking about the weather, now lowered their voices in the shops and crossed the street to avoid awkward glances. The air smelled of old scandal, dug up and exposed to the sun, and despite the murmurs that ran through the village like an underground stream, no one seemed truly satisfied. Because a feeling of incompleteness still hung in the air, as if something else, something deeper, dirtier, remained beneath the surface, untouched. Miss Marple felt it clearly. Julian's capture was the outcome many had hoped for, but not her. She had observed the seams of human crimes for too long to be fooled by a hasty resolution. Something didn't fit. A piece that, even revealed, hadn't been put in its proper place. Mid-morning the next day, he went to visit Reverend Castleton. This time he didn't order tea. He got straight to the point. "Reverend," he said as they sat down in the parlour, "how long have you known what really happened to Edmund Cleaver?" The man's face, always neat and solemn, immediately hardened, not with surprise, but with resignation. "From the beginning," she replied bluntly. "Since before they found him dead. He wrote to me. He asked me for help." "And why didn't you offer it?" "Because I didn't know if I deserved it, or if I could bear what it took to do it." Silence settled between them with the weight of the years. "You were involved too, weren't you? Not the murder," he clarified firmly. "But what preceded it, yes. 20 years ago, I was new to the parish, inexperienced. Edmund convinced me it was best to close my eyes to a financial mistake. A minor embezzlement, he called it, said he'd pay it back, that it was temporary. He and Hawthorne shared an account. I signed a document to help cover it up. I thought I was doing the right thing, for the sake of the town, for peace, and she's been paying for it ever since," Miss Marple murmured, in silence, with her gaze fixed on an altar that no longer responds the same. The Reverend leaned back in his chair, tired. When Edmund announced he was going to confess everything, I was afraid he'd drag my name into his own. My wife, she knew part of it, but never everything. I kept quiet, as always, and Julian, he didn't know anything about it. He was just desperate for the inheritance. But I don't think he poisoned him." Miss Marple stood up slowly. "Me neither. Julian was a coward, yes, capable of lying, manipulating, even destroying a diary. But not something so calculated, so cruel. Belladonna isn't an impulsive poison. It's the act of someone patient, someone who wanted to punish without staining themselves." He left the rectory with his hands clasped behind his back and his thoughts focused on a single figure, Mrs. Castleton. That afternoon, Inspector Bell accompanied her to the house. "Are you sure?" she asked as they walked up the cobblestone path. "More than ever," Miss Marple replied. "The only thing we needed was to understand who had the composure to administer poison day after day, feigning care, feigning routine, and above all, who had something more to lose than a reputation, a life carefully built on a lie." Mrs. Castleton greeted them with her usual composure. She offered them admittance, but Miss Marple refused. "Just one question, ma'am," he said. "Did you prepare the teas for Edmund during his visits?" Yes, I always took the same one, with honey. I said it calmed my nerves." "And you remained his confidant despite everything." "Why? Because he owed me something. Something he never said out loud, and when he threatened to say it, a blink, barely a second." Then Mrs. Castleton's voice lowered a pitch. "He was a cruel man. He used the truth like knives. He would have destroyed my husband, me, all of us. And not for justice, but for revenge. Is that why you killed him?" Mrs. Castleton closed her eyes. Her response was gentle, undramatic. "I helped him die in silence. What he didn't know is that I had already started long before." Belle looked at her, horrified. "Did you give him belladonna for weeks?" "Small doses, insignificant at first, just enough to weaken him, to make it seem like old age was taking its toll. But in the end, the last tea, that was the one that sealed it all. And the pigeons, I didn't know he was still using them. Until I accidentally read one of his drafts. Then I realized that poison wasn't enough anymore, that his voice would come flying if I didn't stop it. But it was too late." Miss Marple nodded with an old-fashioned sadness. It was never just about money or reputation. It was pride, wounds that neither of you wanted to heal, and you chose to forever keep silent about what he ultimately wanted to say. That night, while Inspector Bell was writing the final report, Miss Marple was knitting by the window. The pigeons were no longer flying, but in her mind she could still hear the fluttering of truths that tried to return, and almost didn't make it. Chapter 10. Where Memories Fly. The days that followed were strangely serene, as if the town, having finally exhaled the truth it had been suppressing for years, was now allowing itself to breathe again. The scandal, of course, didn't disappear entirely, not in a place like Little Davington, where even the daisies seemed to know everything. But it was transformed. What had once been a poisonous rumour became a sad whisper. And instead of judgment, many began to murmur with a kind of compassionate resignation. Mrs. Castleton was taken into custody, albeit discreetly, awaiting a trial that would undoubtedly be as complex as it was silent. Her confession wasn't scandalous or theatrical. It was almost a sigh, like someone who finally removes a dress that's too tight and lets it fall silently. Miss Marple didn't visit her in her cell at the town's makeshift police station. Not out of lack of interest, but because she knew that everything that needed to be said had already been said. She had learned over the years that sometimes the silence following a confession was more eloquent than the truth itself. Instead, he walked to the Cleaver estate once more. It was a pale afternoon, and the branches of the apple trees were already beginning to bloom white blossoms. The front door was open. Julian, released after his innocence in his uncle's death was confirmed, was mechanically gathering his belongings. He didn't seem relieved or grateful, just exhausted. "Will you be going back to Norwich?" Miss Marple asked from the doorway. "I don't know," he replied without looking at her. "I don't have much to go back to any more. Not much to inherit, apparently." Sometimes what you inherit isn't what you expect, but it still leaves a mark. Julian left his uncle's pocket watch on a dresser. He didn't claim it. I never fully understood it. He lived surrounded by birds, but he didn't trust anyone. He kept diaries that he later hid. He talked to himself. And yet, it seems like he'd been protecting secrets that weren't his for 20 years. Or maybe they were his too, shared. It's funny how guilt doesn't always come from the act, but from complicity. Edmund chose to remain silent until he couldn't stand it anymore. And that redeems him. No, but it explains it. Julian nodded silently. Then he picked up his coat and left, leaving behind more than a house, an entire shadow. That same afternoon, Miss Marple met Daisy in the park. The girl was sitting on the swing, her legs crossed, an open book on her lap. Her mother, a few feet away, was knitting in the sunshine. They were back to their routine, although it wasn't the same anymore. "How are you feeling today, dear?" "Better," Daisy replied. "Mum says I'm very brave, but sometimes I don't want to think about it." "It's normal. Seeing the truth is sometimes harder than telling it. Is the lady from the church going to jail? That's for others to decide, but you did the right thing, and that, in time, brings peace, even if it takes time." The girl looked down at the book. It was a collection of fables. In the illustration on the open page, a dove was flying toward a distant tower. And the pigeons, Miss Marple? Do you think they'll come back next year? Miss Marple smiled. Maybe not the same ones, but others, yes. They always come back. That's what message-bearing creatures are like. They always find their way back. That evening, Inspector Bell stopped by Miss Marple's house to deliver a small wooden box they had recovered from the attic of the Cleaver estate. Inside, neatly arranged and protected from dust, were dozens of never-sent messages. Small notes tied with red string. Some were blank. Others were barely started. "You know what's strange?" Bell said. "None of these have an addressee, no date, as if Edmund wrote them just to have them, and then decided to do nothing." "Not everyone writes to be read," she replied, caressing the lid of the box. "Some write so they won't forget who they are, or who they were. Sometimes writing is the only way to hold on without breaking." Bell remained silent. Then he bowed his head and said goodbye. Miss Marple remained in her living room, alone, with the box on the table and her half-finished knitting on her knees. Outside, the night was quiet, and through the half-open window, a soft fluttering of wings drifted in. A single white feather fell onto the windowsill. There was no message, just a memory. Chapter 11. A Whisper in the Rain. The next morning dawned with a gentle rain, the kind that doesn't soak but moistens the thoughts. Little Davington seemed enveloped in a light mist that blurred the edges of the houses and softened the sound of footsteps on the wet stones. Everything passed with an almost fictitious calm, as if the town wanted to convince itself that what they had experienced in the last few days had been just a bad dream. But things were never the same again, no matter how hard we tried. At the bakery, Mrs. Perry hummed as she kneaded dough, but her melody lacked its usual lightness. At school, the children played indoors, and although their laughter continued, it was clear that something invisible weighed on their games. Even the church bell rang more quietly, as if in respect of the morning that no one had declared. Miss Marple, wrapped in her light grey coat, walked leisurely along the path that bordered the cemetery. She carried a white flower, a single camellia, perfect, without a blemish, and stopped in front of an unmarked grave made of ancient mossy stone, like many in that forgotten corner of the village. There she sat on the nearby wooden bench and waited, not to someone, but to something. The past, I thought, doesn't always strike like thunder. Sometimes it returns like a steady, persistent drizzle that creeps in without warning. Unexpectedly, Fred Whitcomb, the postman, appeared at her side, a reserved man with ironclad habits and few words. He was almost always seen on his bicycle, regardless of the weather. But this morning he was walking, and he was carrying a letter. "Miss Marple," he said, with a slight nod. "I thought it appropriate that you should see her." He handed her the letter, somewhat crumpled without an envelope. The sender's stamp had been clumsily torn off. Where did this come from? Among the remains of Edmund's desk, I found it at the bottom of a secret drawer, broken by damp. It was stuck between two panels. I thought it was junk. But when I read it, Miss Marple didn't reply. She just unfolded the paper as carefully as she might have unwrapped a dry leaf in autumn. The handwriting was unmistakable, firm, pained, and addressed to someone unexpected. "Dear Margaret, I've tried to write to you many times, and I've always torn up the page before finishing. But now I feel I can't keep silent any longer. Not for myself, but for you. For what we both keep silent. I never knew if your decision was out of fear, duty, or shame. But I failed too. I chose silence to protect you, and in that silence grew things darker than we imagined. I know you hate me, or maybe worse, that you don't think about me anymore. But when you read this, if you ever do, you'll know I still remember everything. Not the scandal, not the money, not the guilt. I remember your voice in the rain, and your hand trembling when you said it was better if no one else knew. Maybe it was true, but someone always knows, and sometimes, that someone is 8 years old and hiding behind a wall. Miss Marple let the silence absorb the last line. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. Fred sighed. "Margaret, Mrs. Castleton." "Yes," she said gently. This letter wasn't going to be sent. It was a mirror, a way to face what he didn't have the courage to tell her in person. But the message arrived, late, like the doves, but it arrived. Do you think it would have changed everything? Maybe not the facts, but the way we remember them. And that, sometimes, is more powerful than justice. Fred left without another word. Miss Marple, on the other hand, stood there, watching the fair rain form small rivulets along the gravestones. The water was cleansing, yes, but it was also revealing, and in that instant she realized that the entire town, with its neat gardens and impeccable morals, had been washing away a collective guilt for years. A community that preferred not to look, that accepted comfortable versions, that allowed a little girl to be the only brave witness. She rose slowly and placed the camellia on the unmarked grave, not for Edmund, not even for Margaret, but for everything that was never said, for the secrets whispered between hedges, for the unsent letters and the truths that flew on white wings, and didn't always return. That night, the rain stopped and, for the first time in weeks, the bells rang cleanly, not to announce a crime or to call for justice, but to remind us that, even in a place as small as Little Davington, the truth always finds a way to return. Like doves. Chapter 12. The Final Flight. 3 weeks passed between Mrs. Castleton's confession and the official arrest. In Little Davington, spring was beginning to settle in with determination. Green shoots timidly appeared between the bare branches, and wildflowers splashed colour along the muddy paths. But the new season didn't bring forgetting. It only accommodated memory. In the parish hall, Inspector Bell gave a brief briefing to close the case. It was a sober meeting, without any grand revelations or applause. Bell wasn't a man of speeches, but his words were clear. Mr. Edmund Cleaver was murdered by gradual poisoning. The person responsible, as is known, is Mrs. Margaret Castleton, who admitted to administering belladonna in controlled doses over several weeks, culminating in a lethal dose on the day of the fair. A suppressed murmur ran through the room. However, Bell continued, the motive wasn't solely to protect her husband or preserve her reputation. It was, above all, the fear of exposing a past they both shared with the deceased, a mistake made years before, hidden away, and which Edmund had decided to reveal. Bell thanked the neighbours for their cooperation and left with his assistant. The atmosphere hung for a moment, until someone coughed and stood up to leave. That's how truths are in the villages. They're heard, accepted, and stored away. Like winter clothes that are stored in trunks, even though you know you'll need them again. Miss Marple didn't speak during the meeting. She waited until everyone had left, then walked to the church altar, where Daisy was waiting with her mother. The girl was holding a small cage. Inside, a white dove was peacefully pecking at the remains of the grain. "Is it okay to release her? Here, Miss Marple?" Daisy asked. "It's the perfect place," she replied with a soft smile. "It all began here, and it can end here." Daisy opened the cage. The dove leaped out, took flight, and soared between the arches of the roof before escaping, through an open window. Everyone followed it with their eyes. No one spoke, but in the air something felt lighter. Later, sitting together in Miss Marple's garden, the girl asked, "Why did Edmund keep all of that to himself for so long? Why didn't he tell the truth sooner?" "Because sometimes," Miss Marple said, pouring herself a cup of tea, "grown-ups confuse loyalty with silence. They think silence is protection, but the truth always finds a way out. And when it can't find one, it turns into a burden, or into poison. And you think he knew they were going to kill him?" Miss Marple thought for a few seconds. "I think so. At least he sensed it. That's why he sent the messages. They weren't warnings, really. They were attempts at redemption. He wanted to force others to speak before he did. He wanted to leave the pieces in place, even though he knew he wouldn't see the whole board. And Mrs. Castleton, do you think she regretted it?" Miss Marple put the cup back on the saucer. "I think so, but not for the crime exactly. She regretted having loved a man who knew how to use guilt as a weapon, of having remained faithful to a decision made in a moment of weakness and sustained for a lifetime. Remorse doesn't always stem from the act. Sometimes it stems from everything we did to sustain it." Daisy didn't respond. She just stroked the feather she'd saved from the pigeon with her finger. She looked at it as if it were a memory, or a promise. That night, Miss Marple wrote a letter. Not for the police, not even for the newspapers. It was a letter addressed to herself, as she did from time to time, a way of putting the world in order, of tying up the loose threads of a story that seemed to have told itself. The crime wasn't passionate or impulsive. It was woven with care, with years of resignation, with long silences and exchanged glances. Poison was only the means. The true weapon was time. Edmund wasn't innocent, nor was he a victim. He was a man who decided to face his mistakes too late. But he did, and she, Margaret, was guilty not only of killing him, but of remaining silent when one voice, just one, could have saved many things. But the voice that spoke wasn't that of an adult. It was that of a child. And that, more than the truth, was what brought justice. He kept the letter in his empty tea box, the same one where he kept other ancient truths that the world had already forgotten. Outside, on the roof, a new dove landed. It had no message. "I just came to rest,"